Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're joining us from the United States. On behalf of the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, or more simply the Hub, based here in beautiful southern Italy, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. And thank you for joining us today for our Southern Talks regarding China in Africa. If I might introduce myself, my name is Conor Sheedy, and I'm part of the knowledge management team here at the Hub. Today is the third of the Southern Talks, online events where we invite experts to discuss their perspectives on topics related to peace and security in Africa and the Middle East. If you have not seen our previous Southern Talks, you can find them easily on our YouTube channel at NATO Strategic Direction-South Hub. This event is also being recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few days. Just a quick reminder that all of those registered and present in the chat box may send us questions using the chat box during the briefing, which will take up approximately half an hour of the next hour, after which there will be an open Q&A session based on the questions we have received. And so to today's event. We are honored and delighted to have Dr. Alex Vines, OBE, with us today. He is head of the Africa program at Chatham House in London. Good afternoon and welcome to you, Dr. Vines.
Thank you very much.
I will not be so bold as to anticipate the content of your presentation or to even attempt to summarize your background. So if you would like to introduce yourself more fully and tell us a little bit about yourself, then we can move on to benefiting from your wealth of knowledge and experience on the topic of China in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Conor, and thank you for everyone joining. It's a real privilege for me talking to the NATO Strategic Direction South. I've worked at Chatham House for over 20 years. Chatham House is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's a not-for-profit organization. It's 103 years old this year. It came out of the Great War. I've also worked for the United Nations. I was a UN sanctions inspector in West Africa, Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone. I've also worked for private sector doing due diligence and K&R, kidnap and ransom for control risks early in my career. I've also worked for the human rights movement for over 15 years, working for Human Rights Watch, the New York-based NGO, working on business and human rights, but also arms and human rights. So that gives a bit of a flavor of who I am. Chatham House's work is a lot focused on geopolitics, hence I think the invitation to speak about China in Africa today. So back to you, Conor.
Well, thank you very much for that, Alex. I believe today you're going to begin with giving us a presentation and share perhaps your slides with us. So without further ado, if you would like to go ahead with that.
So I'm going to talk about China's Africa engagement trends in 2023. And my plan for the next 30 minutes is to kind of contextualize this also. Just a few reminders on the African continent and why it's so important. Point number one is this is the youngest continent in the world. So that means 25% of the UN General Assembly is made up of African countries. So the numbers game really matters in terms of the number of African countries that are represented. So 54 African states, but also increasingly the size of population and growth. So everywhere else is maturing and plateauing out, but the African population is really growing. So in 2050, for example, Nigeria will be the third largest country in the world by population. That's after India and China. Having said that, one of the key issues that we are seeing in the continent still is stubborn poverty. This has been exacerbated by COVID in particular. And so whereas the rest of the world sees a steep declining level of poverty, it's very stubborn in Africa and has plateaued, and is actually, this slide is designed by the UK's Ministry of Defence, but actually absolute poverty levels have actually grown in the African continent just recently. partly courtesy of the shock of COVID on the African continent, but also kind of the inflationary costs that we've seen recently. Now, it's also the it's the least resilient continent in the world. And so I do just want to kind of highlight climate change as one of the big issues. So it's demographics and it's climate change and it's poverty. These are big drivers on the African continent still. And climate change, it depends on the modeling. The slide on the left, the picture on the left shows the whole Sahel belt, for example. That's just the area south of the Sahara being badly impacted by climate change. There is some other modeling which is suggesting that it's only part of the Sahel. Some other parts of the Sahel might actually get more rainfall. So the science isn't perfect. But what we can say is that rising temperatures and rising sea levels are definitely impacting the African continent. Now, members of NATO are particularly also concerned by the following, which is the importance of commodities and their production on the African continent. And so this is a key issue for NATO members, but it is also for NATO's competitors, including China. And so supply chains and access to particularly strategic and critical minerals are really important. And the map here is again from the UK's Ministry of Defence, but does show a number of the key commodities that the African continent produces, ranging from uranium to cobalt to bauxite. And then one of the things that we are seeing that's changing further is the following, which is the importance of a number of these for energy transition minerals. It's not by coincidence that, for example, the bauxite mines in the north of Mozambique that Elon Musk and his Tesla group have bought access to them. And so we are seeing across the African continent a bunch of investments into commodities such as graphite, rare earths, lithium, nickel, and so on. And so this slide is a reminder of just how important that is. And so for energy transition, the African continent and its mineral endowments are going to be increasingly important. And this feeds into a later part of my presentation, the importance of ports and transport corridors and transport and supply chains for China, as much as the United States or other NATO members. So, China has been engaged in the African continent for a very long time. In fact, it's been an important continent ever since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1947. China supported several African liberation movements during the Cold War, and for every year bar one since 1950, the foreign minister of the People's Republic of China has visited an African country. So China has always recognized that 54 African states are really important, and they're important for the numbers game. They were important also of moving the UN Security Council seat to the People's Republic of China, Beijing, from Taipei. And China remembers that. In 1971, the votes of African countries were instrumental in winning the PRC control of China's seat in the UN General Assembly and Security Council, displacing representatives of China's nationalist forces who had been defeated in the Civil War and now govern Taiwan. In the following decades, China's focus in Africa switched to eliminating all remaining regimes that recognized Taiwan's government. So that includes Burkina Faso, Malawi, Liberia, Senegal, and others all switched their recognition from Taipei to Beijing. This means that there's only one country left in Africa that recognizes Taipei, and that is 𝘝𝘪𝑒𝑠𝑤𝑎𝑡ini, which still recognizes Taiwan in 2023. 𝘝𝑚𝑒𝑠𝑤𝑎𝑡ini, by the way, for some of you, you may not have realized, has been rebranded. It used to be known as Swaziland. It's that small landlocked country in southern Africa. In 1999, China created its going out strategy, which encouraged Chinese companies to invest beyond China. This strategy was a statement of China's growing economic might and created a new wave of Chinese engagement in Africa. It was also an important source of employment for Chinese citizens at that time, working on new infrastructural projects. For example, I'm an expert on Angola and have done plenty of field research and written on Angola. at the peak of Chinese investments, out of a population of 19 million at the time, nearly 20 million, we had probably 195,000 Chinese migrant workers working on projects in Angola. This was an enormous input of Chinese in that first phase of going out. And what they did do was provide rapid infrastructural development. And some of it was good, some of it was bad, and some of it, I have to admit, was pretty ugly and ineffective. And we can, in the Q&A, discuss all of that. In November 2023, the first triennial forum of China-Africa cooperation, FOCAC, was held in Beijing. FOCAC has been created to improve cooperation between China and African states and signaled China's growing strategic initiative in Africa. I believe that actually the FOCAC was a prototype for something that we then hear about and still hear about today, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. So in 2013, China's Belt and Road Initiative was launched by Xi Jinping, featuring an ambition to reinvigorate the old trading routes along the East African coast. This should theoretically have seen Chinese investment concentrated in East Africa, but many other African states also saw opportunities through BRI, making the initiative quickly expand in scope and ambition, and it's pretty global now. So what we've seen over the last 20 years is a significant increasing of Chinese re-engagement in the African continent. They had been there historically, both during the Cold War, as I've mentioned, and actually even further back, various Chinese emperors did send exploratory missions to Africa, but they never stayed. So the slide that I've got up in front of you is one that talks about what are the key drivers of China and Africa. And I think they're not dissimilar to if I put one up for the United States or France or the United Kingdom or Italy. I mean, I could choose my NATO country. So resource security, you've already seen the slides, I've talked about them. New markets. Now, the African markets are in the doldrums at the moment, high inflation, contraction because of COVID, but over longer term, I do think that this young continent with 1 billion potential consumers is seen as a final frontier of globalization with an emerging middle class. And although we obviously, for this lecture, are focusing on insecurity, in many ways, there are parts of the African continent that see increased stability, particularly compared with the 1990s. It's also a continent and a space that's important for symbolic diplomacy and development cooperation. Africa is a space where emerging global status can be demonstrated. Sometimes you can experiment in the African continent. This is an unpopular thing to say, but the states are much weaker. So you're going to get less pushback. And if something goes wrong, you may get less blowback than if you're doing it in your immediate near abroad. I mean, how much experimentation can China do in its immediate neighborhood, South China Sea? So I do think we need to look at the African space in those terms. And then I've mentioned it already, but I really want to emphasize it, forging strategic partnerships. 25% of the UN is gathered together, increasingly active and assertive. And so the numbers game is really important, including if you're China, where you are wanting to, inverted commas, modernize international governance systems to be more favorable to China. And so the African votes become really important in this. And that's what we can see. So I'll move on now to the next slide, which is slightly old. My apologies. This comes from the Economist, but it shows that China has embassies in all African countries. It didn't have one in Burkina Faso. I believe it probably has one now. So the only place it doesn't is 𝘝𝑚. But even in the transition process of another country that in recent years switched from Taipei to Beijing, that's the small island state of São Tomé and Príncipe, you could see that China opened a big commercial office, even while the country was still recognizing Taipei, and used that as a kind of bridgehead to then kind of woo and charm the authorities to ditch Taipei. And what we are seeing is that many countries are opening up embassies or reopening them across the African continent. And so NATO members, including Britain, this slide slightly old, have opened up embassies in places like Chad and Niger, for example, and Liberia and Madagascar. So the number is it has significantly grown beyond 36. It's around 40 now, I believe. So it is a place of diplomatic competition, a continent of diplomatic competition. Now, one of the big pieces of work that Chatham House did, and we published a report at the end of last year, is on public debt burden in Africa and the exposure to China. So turning back to the Belt and Road Initiative, that saw a huge number of signature infrastructure projects built across Asia and Africa funded by Chinese loans whose size, nature and origin were often opaque. Some African countries were badly exposed to Chinese lending during this period. From what we can see, Chinese lending peaked in 2016. And since then, Chinese loans to Africa have declined significantly, falling from 28.4 billion in 2016 to 1.9 billion in 2020. Now, those figures are stark also because of COVID. They've improved a bit, but it's also a reflection of changing priorities in Chinese domestic politics. And it's also partly due to the difficulty of African countries having to repay those loans. China has taken a position contrary to Western stroke NATO governments in its African investment. It characterizes its loans as mutually beneficial cooperation between developing countries, promising not to interfere in the internal politics of those that it loans to. In this respect, it presents itself in contrast to Western countries who are accused by China and some African governments of arrogant democratic posturing, often by former colonial powers that looted African resources during the 18th and 19th centuries. In reality, China has been learning by doing. And the reality of large-scale investments have taught Chinese investors to limit their approach. For instance, during the South Sudanese civil war, China had to deal with representatives of various forces opposed to the government and to maintain the Greater Nile oil pipeline operated by the Chinese national oil company, the China National Petroleum Corporation. So China says that it has a strategy of mutual respect and non-interference. Well, actually, what we're seeing is that China is developing interest and is becoming a lot more assertive. So it's becoming more normalized, like many other powers that we've seen on the African continent in the past, even though it still plays up the discourse of that it is a developing country and it doesn't interfere in host countries' politics. So one of the things we have seen is a whole debate about debt trap diplomacy. US, but also Japanese and Indian commentators often describe Chinese policy in Africa as a debt trap, part of a deliberate strategy to loan unmanageable sums of African countries, drawing them into China's sphere of influence and force unfair commitments upon them. Some African nations do have extensive Chinese loans and are suffering from out-of-control debt, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and high interest rates. I've mentioned all three of those. But their situations cannot be entirely blamed on Chinese loans. States, including Kenya and Zambia, have poorly managed their debts to all creditors, not only China. Meanwhile, other African countries have created realistic, manageable debt arrangements with China without the tremendous risk and uncertainties that characterize some of the major Belt and Road Initiative projects. China also faces significant problems due to extensive loans made during the BRI boom period, and it is struggling to force repayment while maintaining its image as a friend of developing nations. In fact, what we're seeing in a number of the negotiations over debt, that it's a typical situation of many organizations that suddenly get owed a lot of money. They want to get repaid first. So it's pay us first, China first. And the Chinese are beginning to realize that doesn't land well. And so they're going to have to be a lot more collegiate and collaborative and there's a lot more hard negotiation going on. So we did a study, as I mentioned, and this slide that you have in front of you is a composition of total Chinese loan commits to African countries by financier from 2010 to 2020. It goes to, again, this slide shows you the peak in 2016 and the steep decline in 2020. Here you have, this is based on our own research at Chatham House, the top 20 recipients of Chinese loans from 2020 from 2000 to 2020. Angola takes the lion's share of this. Ethiopia is the second, and then a number of other countries that have been mentioned, Zambia, for example, and Kenya. So these are all quite significant. And this slide also shows, again, the input of Chinese foreign direct investment stock in 2020 and which countries they're focused on. So most countries in Africa, except for Eswatini, which is right down there in gray, do get Chinese foreign direct investment. But actually what you see is that certain countries, particularly with mineral resources and strategic locations, get a lot more focus than others. So the Chinese are discerning, even if they're equitable from a baseline. Our research on BRI at Chatham House has found that that BRI was largely uncoordinated and unplanned, with credit offered by competing Chinese lenders. So actually it was a bit Wild West, I have to admit to you, with Chinese lenders that I interviewed not knowing what each other were doing. They were actually encouraged to be in steep competition with you. So this does, I think, contradict the idea of a coherent debt trap policy by China. Having said that, our research does suggest that a country that is significant and important for NATO, Djibouti, does look as if it was deliberately debt entrapped. So that, I think, is because of its geostrategic location, right on the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, and because of all the military bases that are actually present there, and also because of being a bridgehead to an important transport corridor into the hinterland to Ethiopia that was important for China. So in one case, we would argue in terms of our research at Chatham House that there probably is evidence of debt trap, but we don't find it anywhere else where we think it's more been used as a kind of political narrative out of Tokyo, Delhi, and Washington, but doesn't actually stack up with the evidence. However, as I say, the idea that China may be using debt traps strategically to expand its influence in the African continent and secure access to resources cannot be completely dismissed. China is an emerging superpower. It's in strategic competition with the US and NATO, and building strong economic relationships in Africa would be a logical step in its aspirations to be a global power. So for analysts like me, I need to keep vigilant. What we've seen so far shows that there is a precedent potentially in Djibouti, and so it could happen again. The next slide here is just to remind us again, I apologize, the data goes up to 2020 that I'm showing you, of the kind of where trade is and who are Africa's main trading partners. So the previous slide showed how China's trade is surging past the United States. African countries have recognized this, but in geopolitics, they are looking to diversify. So that doesn't mean they want all China. We are in an age of multipolarity, and from what I'm seeing, we're therefore seeing African countries trying to position themselves to attract European funding, Turkish funding, US funding, sometimes a bit of Russian funding, although that's very rare to find at the moment. Clearly China's part of the mix. So it's about multipolarity and mixing. We have here just a reminder, I've been talking about it. I wanted just to kind of have a slide just to show you about where the original Belt and Road, Silk Road plans were, but they're much more extensive than that. Another thing that China has been doing is that it's been it was, I think, a watershed in its FOCAC summit, in that it really did try and define what its strategic interests in the African continent were and are and should be. And what we see is that a lot of other countries have followed this subsequently. We just had the second Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, for example, At the end of last year, there was the second US-Africa Leaders Summit. The United Kingdom is having its second UK African Investment Summit in April next year. And so I do think we need to credit China for subtly having forcing policymakers to reappraise what their partnership is with the African continent and be a lot more strategic about it. So in a way, China provided a kind of a lightning bolt into complacency about partnerships with the African continent, and Africans woke up that actually competition might be good for them. And so I think this is what we're seeing with this plethora of summits. China does try and use its diplomatic influence, including its economic diplomacy in buying influence. So there is, these slides do show when there are votes in UNGA and in the UN General Assembly, how does that relate to abstaining and voting pro-China, for example, on Hong Kong, for example. And so there is a correlation in terms of that. It is a very mercantilist approach in the end. It's looking about how it can use the African continent to procure commodities, but also expand its own markets for its manufactured products. And we can see here that since 2006, there was an Africa policy statement that pledged to promote high-level military exchanges and capacity building, although it didn't mention arms sales. Military assistance to Africa has increased significantly. And China has also significantly increased its footprint of its, for example, of its defense attachés, defense advisors on the continent. So that's also played a significant role. China's military engagement also comes through multilateral fora. So, for example, in 1989 was the first time China provided personnel for the UNCTAD operation for the independence in Namibia. And now China considers peacekeeping as a core activity at the UN. For example, in 2020, China had 2,531 soldiers under UN command. And this continues to be an important part of Chinese diplomacy, including emphasizing that China believes in multilateralism, it believes in the international system. And I see this as a bit of offsetting of the difficulties that China has in explaining its activities in the South China Sea, ignoring and in fact saying that the international judgments on the South China Sea and demarcation are wrong. And so Africa is seen as a way of kind of complicating the narrative about China and China being more consistent in this regard. It's also about managing risk. I don't think China will be wishing to open ostentatiously in the near future any more military bases. I'll come on to a slide about Djibouti, where there is one that was opened in 2017. But I do think China will still want to show that it is supporting international peacekeeping and the UN system, at the same time as arguing that there needs to be a significant UN Security Council reform. So foreign military presence, of course, is significant on the African continent, although declining. I mean, we heard President Macron of France's speech about the withdrawal of French troops from Niger by the end of this year. But Djibouti remains a location where many countries have military footprint, and the Chinese decided that that was the place for them too. And so in 2017, the People's Liberation Army opened a military facility costing some $550 million, which was basically also to support Chinese constabulary efforts, anti-piracy, but also in case that China needed to provide relief for their citizens in distress. Having experienced this in Libya in 2011 with the Gaddafi regime, China has experienced significant difficulties evacuating its citizens, which was a shock domestically. In fact, in several countries, the Chinese had to use Western support, either United States or French, for example, which is something that that officials in Beijing don't want to talk about. China, as I mentioned, has also expanded its network of defense attaches in Africa, with increasing defense sales in the continent, which experienced 55% growth between 2012 and 2017. In fact, that figure has grown subsequently also since then. And one of the interesting things is I do think that China is benefiting from the difficulties that the Russian Federation is finding at the moment in providing weapons and following through on sales because of its overexposure to the Ukraine conflict. And so China has actually seen that this is a way of expanding its own market share. So this is a paradox. There is some information that suggests that a few years ago, Russia asked whether it could share a facility, the Chinese facility in Djibouti, but American, French, and other lobbying of the Djibouti government ensured that that never came beyond just some informal kind of testing the waters. Now, we do see also a challenge, two kind of different narratives taking place in the Western Indian Ocean, where you do have serious competition between China and India. So the left-hand slide is what's called string of pearls. The Indian media talk a lot about it, which is a number of different footprints where China has berthing rights or has been investing in ports. And on the right-hand side, you have something called the string of flowers, which is India trying also to do the same thing. So the Western Indian Ocean is a hotspot for competition, basically, particularly militarily between India and China. And I think this is something that we can expect more of. Now, African states themselves don't necessarily want to go into something binary, China versus India. So, for example, the Seychelles government has played a hard-nosed game with both countries, in fact, including denying India the right to open a military facility on Assumption Island. So I think we'll kind of see this also, that full-fledged military facilities in the Western Indian Ocean, more of them might be less likely, but berthing rights and other kind of lesser activities, I think we'll see. India does have a kind of intelligence gathering facility on Madagascar. It's not quite like the facility that China has in Djibouti, but it does have a footprint. I'm watching the time, so I'm going to end shortly. But over the last month, there's been really heightened kind of speculation of more Chinese military bases in Africa and globally. And this is Foreign Policy magazine, numbering the likelihood and location of them. I just caution on this. I think we need to be a bit careful. Chatham House itself did a detailed literature review of what are the sources of information for this and where does this speculation come from. I'm afraid that we find that a lot of the fingerprints or footprints lead back to information that comes out of Washington. And so this may be as much about anxiety in Washington about that this could happen in the future than actually hard evidence that it's happening today. Having said that, I also do think that some African leaders, to get attention for balancing their international relations, particularly getting attention from the West, might have conversations with China about providing some sort of facility, and then making sure that their Western counterparts are aware of this. So this is kind of negotiating, basically, and is kind of the politics of multipolarity. So again, I wouldn't, we have the precedent of the base in Djibouti. I think we might be looking at a different sort of approach in the future, particularly using commercial port facilities, which can be multi-purpose to support some sort of military, visit, for example, by the People's Liberation Army Navy. So it might not be exactly like what we've seen in Djibouti, but certainly there's clear evidence that the People's Liberation Army Navy does want some blue water capability. And so I think that's one of the routes for that speculation. And then finally, I just did want to highlight fish, because it's a significant problem. Illegal fishing in West Africa is a big deal. The UK-based Environmental Justice Foundation says that at least 90% of the industrial trawlers operated in Ghana are owned by Chinese corporations in contravention of Ghanaian law. I've just come back from Ghana. I was there all last week, and the fishing communities that I was talking to were very negative about the contribution of Chinese fishing. And it's very difficult in the end to prosecute and get to the bottom of this. I have been involved in investigation as an investigator on this. So this slide is just like, well, what's the name of the ship? Where does it come from? We've even got evidence of them painting a new name when we were, flying a drone over, filming what was going on. And to get a prosecution is like any organized crime. There are also shells that really find it difficult to kind of boil down to. So this is a particular vessel that was arrested in Tanzania. It had 3 different names on the hull, registration certificate, and authorization of fish. It had a Kenyan agent. It flew under the Omani flag. It was owned by a Taiwanese company, but the ultimate beneficial owner was Chinese. So that just goes to show you just how difficult it is to deal with illicit, unreported, and unregulated fishing and hold some of these Chinese companies to account. So finally, that's me. If you want to be on the Africa lists, please just email me and I'll put them on there on the list. And now we have some time for Q&A. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was extremely informative and wonderfully comprehensive, if I may say. I'm sure you would have happily gone on and explained more to us. It's such a broad topic. Because of the technical issues there, the questions in the chat room are not quite available to me just yet. So if you wouldn't mind, something I'm particularly interested in, you mentioned that China seeks stability, which is obviously convenient for its commercial purposes, and that following Libya and Yemen, its personnel and commercial objectives are its priority in Africa, which might not be exactly the same, as you mentioned, in the ocean to the east. One thing I heard recently was that the Western, if you like, approach to development is to first look for stability, almost to insist on stability, and then begin investing in order to help nations develop. And that perhaps the Chinese have a rather different approach. They tend to focus primarily on the development, believing that that will carry forward stability. 2 parts to this question. Would you think that that's true? And secondly, how do you think the African nationals see this issue?
Great question. Thanks, Conor. Well, first of all, when China re-engaged the going out strategy at the, around the millennium, 2000, 2001, the markets that were open for China were often ones that the West had avoided. And so, those are countries that were under, sanctions from NATO members, US sanctions. I'm thinking of Sudan, for example, as one example. And so that's where you suddenly see, and also countries where the West, it wasn't prepared to go in big time. So the end of the Angolan Civil War in 2001-2, the Angolans wanted an international donors conference. And the US and Western partners were like, well, no, you're going to have to do that. We've got other priorities, including Afghanistan. And a US ambassador, very undiplomatically, when the Angolans said, well, isn't that double standards? He turned to his the Angolan minister said, well, we invaded Afghanistan. We didn't invade Angola. So that's our priority. So what happens then is that then, the Angolans and others turn to China. And so that's where you have some of the really rapid infrastructural development. And gradually, China moved out from those locations. And so I think we're in a completely different phase now, which is that some of those were risky places to invest. I mean, Sudan's in civil war. South Sudan hasn't had a good, early independence record neither. And so you're seeing that the new loans that China is lending tend to be countries that they're in competition with the West, Ivory Coast, Senegal, because they've realized that they're going to get a better return for that. They manage the risk better. There's something else that I think has gone on, which is that countries that have been post-conflict that the West invested heavily in. Sierra Leone is one example of it, where the United Kingdom itself and the UN ended a civil war 20 years ago, stabilized the place. Well, guess who's the beneficiary commercially of that? China is the majority investor in Sierra Leone. And so I think we're into a different episode now of this story. We're also seeing a lot less big infrastructural investments by China. This is also to do with the credit crunch at home and issues that are happening in China. But we are still seeing quite a lot of small and medium-sized Chinese companies investing in the African continent. So even the profile of Chinese investment is shifting. And Africans increasingly want multipolarity. You know, the Angolans are moving a bit more to being truly non-aligned, slightly leaning to be pro-Western, because they found that, you know, having a quarter of total Chinese debt to Africa, $45 billion US, is not a place you want to be. So Angola has applied to be a member of the Francophonie and the Commonwealth, for example, which is, I think, again, trying to broaden out relationships and not be tied to one relationship too closely, one partnership.
Okay, I believe our general would like to ask a question, if I can just see if that's going to work. Just one moment. I see. So China is frequently associated with movements of messages while somebody is reading them. No, that's not it. So China is frequently associated with rare earths and strategic materials. Is there an evidence that shows that China has extended its efforts to control rare earths in Africa?
So good question. At the moment, in terms of locking in supplies of commodities just for China, we don't necessarily see that in terms of commodities. But what we do see is China investing still heavily in transport corridors and ports. And so it clearly wants to ensure that there's unimpeded access of commodities to international markets and potentially to China. So there is a nuance in this, in my response here, that it isn't like completely owning a mine and then everything goes to China. There's no evidence of that yet. If their behavior on oil was anything to go by, Sudanese oil is really pretty awful stuff. And in fact, the Chinese decided to sell it on the open market and then buy better crude for China on the open market with the money they made. So paradoxically, quite a lot of Sudanese oil went to Japan, for example. Now, of course, with growing tensions around South China Sea and relationship between China and the West, that might change. But earlier phase of Chinese behavior was to actually use market forces to determine kind of destination of particular commodities.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. You mentioned earlier the term learning by doing. One of our registrants has, you mentioned China's freedom of trial and error, using it somewhat as a proving ground. What would be the most impactful lesson the West or NATO could learn from this, both positive and negative? And if I might just add one small part to that, how difficult is it to understand China's foreign policies at the moment? A direct part to this question, because the current situation perhaps in the Chinese government is somewhat tumultuous. So how would you think about that?
Yeah, so obviously we have a missing Minister of Defense of China, and it's all very complicated. And Yeah, Africans, even when I was in West Africa last week, were scratching their heads of, how to handle this. What they want is one of the things they thought they had with China was more predictability, actually. Not the uncertainty of a US election and does Mr. Trump get in again, but kind of continuity of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And yet what they're seeing now is a great deal more opacity and transparency. At a time also that China is retreating from Africa from a high watermark. So they're still there, they're still important, but it's not what, the honeymoon is over. And so I would have answered the question of what could NATO learn from China as being, one issue being kind of consistency. But of course, that's now changing with China too. So the Chinese had been fairly consistent in terms of what their overall ambitions were, and also in terms of resorting to private diplomacy, not public diplomacy. So not naming and shaming in public, the rhetoric of, kind of win-win, mutual, kind of beneficial relations, which was the official rhetoric. But it is a lot more complicated now. There's no doubt about it. And China, I think, is going to increasingly find it difficult to depict itself as a developing state and part of, the kind of G77. Right. It's clearly, an emerging superpower, and its behavior is changing. Yes,
certainly the next few years will no doubt be quite revelatory.
So, I mean, one lesson I think, so this is a really difficult thing, is still to think through. Are there any areas where at least there can be dialogue between NATO and China related to Africa, and where it isn't just China being transactional, sucking up intelligence, but not reciprocating with anything? So I remain convinced that Africa can be an area for some types of coexistence, if not very limited cooperation, given that's impossible in the South China Sea.
And do you think the existence of so many different entities in Djibouti almost makes it necessary for at least the beginning of cooperation, and that might be a foot in the door, or at least keep the door slightly open?
So what's the terms of reference if you bump into a Chinese officer in a bar in Djibouti city? At the moment it's run a mile, but it's like, how do you build up some relationships, some conversations, something? This might be something that navies can do, where because culturally there is some more openness for, informal dialogue. I don't think we can't be naive about this, but I just think that there need to remain some ways of at least, being able to have a conversation that this allows some, sharing of information at not a sensitive level, because in the end, we do need to talk to China. At the commercial level, this is happening. For example, I'll give you an example. Rio Tinto are busy building the Trans-Guinea Railway. The military junta there have insisted that China and Rio Tinto work together. So the financing is Chinese. Rio Tinto are building it, and it's progressing really quickly. And it's a really difficult example to acknowledge, because it's a military junta that officially we don't like. Right. But it's actually told these guys knocking their heads together, get on with it. And suddenly this infrastructure that will be useful for Guinea and for the extraction of a natural resource will occur. Right. Because it had been moribund for years. And I don't think, that can happen with a European member of NATO. Of course, the United States would find that very difficult, and probably the company would be told, no, you can't do it. So this is where there's variation within the NATO family also. But I do think we need to seriously look at those sorts of case studies, particularly what's going on with private sector, where some of the key capital is going to be increasingly from China.
And would you see that as a possible contradiction to many of the comments we're getting and the questions are in relation to finance? You mentioned symbolic diplomacy and cooperation, and recently heard an expression that Africans are very much more interested in competition, and they really do not want competition to become confrontation. Now, we all know, we've all played sports in our lives, competition usually always ends up in confrontation, and it requires a very mature approach to keep it focused on who wants what.
Yeah.
How much African agency is a big thing at the moment, and Africans entering into, as you mentioned, the final frontier of globalization. How strong is their power, and how likely is it that African agency will grow despite the presence of so many foreign actors?
So African agency and confidence is growing, no doubt about it. Your point about managing competition is really key, because you need institutions. So it's not personal interests. It's not like a kleptocrat's, bank balance and wallet that benefits, And so where are there cases which are more developmental that will reduce poverty, will kind of provide some public goods? So these are the big questions that need to be asked. And this is where, Western investments in governance have not been particularly successful. There's one study that says only 3% of all investment in governance has shown any meaningful result. But yet all the academic and other research on what are the underlying causes for coups and failures in the Sahel are absent governance and weak institutions, to the point that militaries often become seen as the only institution that's semi-credible. And so you have coups backed by civilians backing, kind of military juntas who then struggle to deliver on people's expectations. So this is really, and the Sahel is a particular area. I'm not suggesting at all that a lot of Africa is going to have coups, but I do think you need arbiters on this competition, including actually like the military junta did. This is what's so uncomfortable. I think they did the right thing personally to knock the heads together of a big mining company and Chinese financiers to get a piece of infrastructure that's really important to unlock the iron ore in Guinea and get that sorted.
Right. Okay, we're drawing to a close, and you'll be happy to know we have an enormous numbers of questions still to ask on a plethora of different topics. So I'm going to try and ask one simple question to give you the opportunity to highlight what you think is maybe the most important issues, or are the most important issues in relation to China and Africa. So I'm going to read you a sentence which I heard somebody say recently, which was, in Africa, China remains a financial or transactional heavyweight, a middle to lightweight in the political domain, but is still a military featherweight.
So I think that's right. China will not remain a major military security power in Africa, although it will become a very important supplier of defense equipment. So I think that's the big change. And I hadn't imagined that the Russian market share would decline as quickly as it will, and as it has. Having said that, there are others also competing for this space. Turkey is a good example of that. But so I would agree that we're not going to see more Djibouti-style military bases anytime soon. But you will continue to see significant investment in multilateral security arrangements, UN and hybrid peacekeeping, for example, and funding that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I believe we have a minute perhaps left. So I'm afraid to say we have come to the end of this highly enlightening discussion. I hope everybody else has enjoyed it as much as I have and learned from it as much as I have. I would like to say how immensely grateful we at the Hub are to Dr. Vines. It's been a pleasure for giving you so much of your invaluable time, not just today, but also in the run up to this. And all of your team, really, very, very grateful. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to all of you out there for participating and for tuning in. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed the time. We hope to see you again at our next Southern Talks. For those of you who unfortunately have questions that we haven't got around to answering, which seem quite a few, you can include those in our feedback form, which you will receive after this event, and we will do our very best to reply to some of those. As I mentioned at the outset, these discussions will be available in the next few days in video format on our YouTube page at NATO Strategic Direction-South Hub. So with that, I will bring this Zoom event to a close by thanking Dr. Vines once again so much for your time and effort.
Thank you very much, Conor.
Bye-bye. Have a nice evening, and a nice evening to everybody else.